Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome again to the 2022 Annual General Meeting of Kazia shareholders. It's wonderful, as you've heard, to be able to do this in person. Once again, see some familiar faces in the room. And of course, we have a number of shareholders who've joined us online. Really grateful for your time this morning. And I'd like to just thank in passing as well our corporate counsel at Baker McKenzie for their very generous hospitality and hosting us this morning. It's been an eventful year for Kazia, and there's a great deal for us to discuss this morning. So I want to make sure that we make efficient use of everybody's time. I'm going to give a short presentation this morning, just about a dozen or so slides. And I'm going to ask, if I may, that we save questions to the end of the presentation. Some of them may be addressed in the presentation, and at the very least, it'll hopefully provide some useful background for our discussions thereafter. So a brief presentation, and then, as I say, if we can save the questions till the end of the presentation. So next slide, please. And next slide again, please. I just wanted to start with some key points of the year, just to outline some of the things that have been going on for Kazia this year. And this is a sort of greatest hit slide that I presented a little bit of last year. And as you can see here on the slide, we've had over 350 patients now treated with paxilosib in our clinical trial program. That number last year was about 200, so we've almost doubled the number of patients now that have been exposed to the drug through our clinical trials. And that's an important number because as regulatory agencies look at the drug in the context of potential approval, they like to see a critical mass of patients that have been treated. And I think we're starting to get into the sort of range where we have enough data to talk credibly to regulatory agencies about the drug. We've had 10 data readouts this year at international conferences, and we'll touch on a couple of those in a moment, but it's been actually a very productive year for us in terms of data. We've learned a lot about our drug, and we've had the opportunity to put it in front of a great number of clinicians and researchers. 2 special designations from the US FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, 2 regulatory designations, really denote partly, I think, the credibility that attaches to the drug from a regulatory standpoint. There is currently clinical trial activity in 8 countries for paxilosib, so an incredibly broad range of work that's going on. And as you can see here, we've had 2 clinical trials that advanced, have graduated, if you like, to a second stage of their development. It's very fashionable at the moment for clinical trials to be run in these sort of multi-stage designs. 2 of our trials have progressed. One of them, of course, has not, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. And 9 ongoing clinical trials across the 2 drugs in our pipeline. So again, just a huge breadth of work ongoing with paxilosib. We won't talk a great deal today about EVT-801. We'll have a great deal more to say about that, I think, in the new year. But just a note in passing that progress is going well there. We have, as you know, a phase 1 clinical trial underway in Europe. And we have to date had about 85 patient weeks of treatments, a slightly cumbersome measure, but it just gives you a sense that that trial has been moving nicely. And over 24 CT scans now that have been evaluated as part of that. We don't really have a lot of data to share with you today, but as I say, I think we'll have more to say about that study next year. Next slide, please. Now, I wanted to just zoom out and try and show you the total picture of what's been happening with paxilosib this year. And this is a very dense slide, and just say that all our slides today are available on the website, so it's easy to go back and look at this material afterwards. But this is a list of all the work that's going on with paxilosib. And I won't kind of go through in detail here, but I just pick out a few points. The first line on the slide shows the study that we have ongoing with Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in combination with radiotherapy for brain metastases. And we reported great data from that in August. This study showed every patient responding to the combination of paxilosib and whole brain radiotherapy. To give you a point of reference, about 20 to 40% of patients respond to the radiotherapy by itself. So when we're seeing evidence of clinical response in every single patient, this is really a knockout result. And so this got invited for an oral presentation at an ASCO conference in August. Sadly, it came 4 days after the GBM Agile news, which we'll talk about in a moment. It's got a little drowned out, but this is really stellar data, and I think is in one one leap opened up brain metastases as an indication for us. Another brain metastases study, the Alliance study that's being run with multiple drugs, that has advanced to a second stage in breast cancer brain metastases. Now, this study is blinded. We don't have data to show. It's a common refrain, I'm afraid, today, but we know that it's advanced to this second stage in breast cancer brain mets, ongoing in lung cancer and in other cancers. But again, it only advances if the drug's showing some evidence of activity. So I think a very positive signal there. And by the way, the green ticks on this slide are data readouts that have been positive. We've got a third study in brain mets, ongoing breast cancer brain mets at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. I'll be honest and say this study is moving like treacle on a cold day. It's been slow progress, but we did sit down with the investigator in September. He's promising us great things in the near future. So I think we'll have more to say about that study before too long, but for now, that's just ongoing. GBM Agile, we'll talk about more in a few slides' time, but I think the best way I can describe the news that we heard from that study in August is that it's ambiguous. We have no data from the study. It remains ongoing. There are still patients being treated with a drug. There are still patients in follow-ups, evolving day by day. And at the moment, nobody, apart from an inner group of perhaps half a dozen statisticians, has any visibility to data at all. So I think the best we can say about this study is we don't know what's happening there. But as I say, we'll talk more about that in a moment. But for now, we've just put a kind of amber question mark against that. And then as you can see here, DIPG, we've had some positive results there. The PNOC study, the phase 2 study that's ongoing with our drug in this childhood brain cancer, has expanded internationally. It's now opened at 2 sites in Australia, shortly to open in several European countries and in Israel. And suffice to say, these studies don't expand to multiple countries unless something is happening. These people aren't inclined to waste their time. So we think this is a good signal from this study. And again, we'll expect to see some more data out of this next year. And then finally, towards the bottom of the slide here, some really great preclinical data that's current, which has really opened some new areas of possibility for the drug throughout the year. Some stellar data in melanoma in September at the Society for Melanoma Research annual conference. Some very promising data in ATRT, atypical teratoid rhabdoid tumors, a rare childhood brain cancer. And then finally, of course, many people in the room will be familiar with the work of Professor Matt Dunn up in Newcastle at the Hunter Medical Research Institute. And he's actually presenting this week at the Society for Neuro-Oncology annual meeting, his latest data with paxilosib in DIPG. So a great deal happening. And of all the things that we reported this year, I would say in aggregate, we're 7 for 8. We've had 7 projects that are unambiguously showing positive results, and 1 where I think the jury's out, and of course that's GBM Agile. And I'd say that drug development is a test where you never score 100%. So in aggregate, this is actually pretty good going. I think we got a lot of the wrong kind of attention in August, but I would say, to borrow a line from Mark Twain, that reports of paxilosib's demise have been greatly exaggerated. I've been in oncology drug development for over 20 years. This is not the picture of a drug that is failing. Next slide, please. And you don't have to take that from me, because we work, of course, with some of the leading experts in the world in brain cancer, and they continue to support the development of this drug wholeheartedly. So we announced earlier this year the formation of our scientific advisory board. John DeGroot and Patrick Wen, they're 2 of the leading experts in glioblastoma, very senior investigators in the GBM Agile study. Priscilla Brastianos at Harvard Medical School, one of the world experts in brain metastases. Alan Olivero, an expert in the development of PI3K inhibitors, the class to which our drug belongs, and in fact, the inventor of paxilosib. We're meeting with these clinicians tonight in the US, and they continue to support the drug enthusiastically and wholeheartedly. We will be discussing with them its progress across all the different diseases that I've spoken about. So we still command very, very enthusiastic engagement from the clinicians that we work with. Next slide, please. And I think, stepping aside from glioblastoma, I think one of the signature refrains of this year has been that paxilosib has really started to demonstrate its credentials in a broad range of diseases. We've spoken for the last couple of years about the fact that we really have always seen this drug as more than a glioblastoma drug, more even than a brain cancer drug. We've seen this as a very, very broadly applicable cancer drug. But I think this year we finally started to deliver on those expectations. And what's resolved, I think, over the course of this year is three indications, three disease areas that we see as core to the development of the drug: brain metastases, an enormous potential market opportunity, some 200,000 patients a year in the United States. Obviously, 3 ongoing clinical trials there. Glioblastoma, you've heard plenty from me in previous years about that. A smaller opportunity, about 13,000 patients a year, 2 ongoing clinical trials there. And then childhood brain cancer, and in particular, this group of diffuse midline gliomas. That's a kind of newer term for DIPG, but for today, we can regard these two as roughly equivalent. A smaller opportunity, thankfully, about 800 kids a year in the United States, but nevertheless, a very, very important opportunity. And in economic terms, we do have the ability here to earn this priority review voucher from FDA. As previous AGM attendees will recall, this is something that's given to incentivize the development of drugs for children. They sell on the secondary market for about $110 million at present. So 3 lead indications that have emerged very clearly for the drug, positive data across all of them, and then a whole host of other opportunities coming up behind those: primary CNS lymphoma, ATRT, melanoma, breast cancer even. So a lot of work going on behind the scenes in these other diseases. Next slide, please. And I think the beauty of the paxilosib program is that it's at a stage of maturity where we're not talking here, by and large, about experiments in a handful of mice or in a petri dish. We're talking about clear clinical programs, each of which has a path to market. So if we look at the diffuse midline gliomas, the childhood brain cancers, we'll be seeing data we anticipate in the first half of calendar 2023. And on the basis of that, I think we'll start making decisions about how best to move that drug forward towards a commercial market. And I would say that study is fully funded. It's externally funded by grants and by the academic organizations that are running it. So we have no further material financial commitments there. Glioblastoma, we'll see data from the GBM Agile study in the second half of next year. And again, that study, as it turns out, is now fully funded. We have no material further financial commitments for that study either. And then brain metastases, a little bit further behind. This is a newer entrant to the paxilosib portfolio. And we're looking at how we can get that into some sort of pivotal study for registration next year. We had a great meeting in September with some of the leading experts in brain metastases in the US, and they encouraged us to waste no time whatsoever in getting this into a clinical trial. So we're just talking through how to do that. Now, we'll have to work out how to fund that as well, but we have some very warm leads that hopefully should substantially support that study through external funding. So overall, notwithstanding the news that we had in August, I think this really, or I hope that this paints a picture of a program that's actually in pretty rude health and that has a great deal of work going across a very, very broad range of indications. Now, of course, this is not reflected in the share price of the company as it stands today. And I realize this has been an enormous frustration for shareholders, as it has been for all of us. And if we go to the next slide, please, I'd like to start talking a little bit about why some of that is. So this slide is a complex one. On the right hand, it shows our share price over the last few years. And as of yesterday, we're trading around about 10 cents on the ASX. We've had some long dark nights of the soul before in Kazia. I think the period from 2018 to 2020 was a pretty challenging one for all of us as well. And it's been incredibly frustrating that we've given back a lot of the gains that we've made over the last 2 years since then, in fact, trading a little bit below. Now, part of what's happening is clearly that this is one of the worst markets for biotech companies that we've seen in decades. And the bar charts on here reflect some of this data. In the left-hand cluster of bars you see Some of the key indices that we refer to, the S&P 500, the NASDAQ Composite, the NASDAQ Biotechnology Index, the NBI is actually done quite well, and it's sort of held up by some really large cap companies like Amgen. But when you look at the light blue bars, which are biotech ETFs, generally focus on smaller growth companies, probably a better comparator for companies like ours. They're generally down about 40% in the year to 31st of October. It's been a terrible year for PI3K companies. And those are the green bars there. You see TG Therapeutics, Verastem, MEI Pharma. These companies down about 80 to 90% over the course of the year. And then it's actually been quite a tough year for brain cancer companies as well. Chimerix, Y-mAbs, and Kintara Therapeutics shown in the chart now, the purple bars, again on average down sort of 80 to 90%. So this has been an incredibly challenging year for all listed biotech companies, and there's not many that have been riding high in 2022. But this clearly isn't the only thing that's going on, because the reality is that Kazia has been suffering more than the companies on this slide. And so there's clearly some specific things that have been happening to our company. And I want to talk a little bit about a couple of those. So next slide, please. Now, one of the things that's happened this year, of course, has been the news we received from the GBM Agile pivotal study in August. Now, again, just as a reminder for everybody, this study was designed to seek registration for new glioblastoma drugs. It's constructed in 2 stages. So every drug that enters it recruits a first stage of up to 150 patients, and then a second stage of 50 patients. And in between the 2 stages, there is a graduation analysis. Now, the specifics of this graduation analysis are, first of all, very complicated, and second, somewhat confidential to the organization running the study. So I'm not going to go into the detailed statistics behind this analysis. But suffice to say, the bar to which drugs in the study are held is high. This is really a very, very demanding hurdle for a drug to get over. And now the positive to that is that if we had cleared that bar, I would be almost completely confident that we would be looking at an FDA approval for paxilosib. Frankly, I would be introducing you today to our new chief commercial officer, and we'd be in the business of hiring a sales force. We'd be that confident, I think, of the drug being imminently launched. We don't have quite that level of confidence today, but I think we're certainly a very long way from the flip side to that. And I think there's some reasons why we think that perhaps this non-graduation news has been overinterpreted, and outline some of these things here on the slide. So the first thing to say is, as I mentioned, the threshold to graduate to the second stage is very high. This threshold is set by the study. It's not set by FDA. And we think that the threshold for an FDA approval of a new drug in glioblastoma may be somewhat more flexible. And to give you a comparison point, the last drug that was approved for glioblastoma was Avastin. It was approved over 10 years ago. It's only approved for late-stage recurrent patients. It's only approved in a handful of countries. But that drug has never shown any survival benefit in glioblastoma. It's never shown any evidence that it prolongs the life of patients with this disease. And I think what this reflects is that a disease like this, where there are so few drugs available, remember, only one drug approved for first-line patients, only works for 1/3 of those patients. The bar is low. And so we think there's a space where a drug may not quite get the gold medal in GBM Agile, but may still be very acceptable to FDA. So one of our shareholders put in a recent conversation, if you think of this as rolling a dice, we haven't rolled a 6, which would be graduation. We haven't rolled a 1 either, because there is a futility analysis in this study. If the drug just plain doesn't work, it gets dropped. And that has not happened here. That is not the situation we find ourselves in. So there's enough reason for the study to proceed, and that's what's happened. We are still treating patients with paxilosib today. We're still monitoring these patients. So we've rolled at this stage somewhere between a 2 and a 5. And it may be that perhaps a 4 and a 5 may yet see us to an FDA registration. couple of other things going on in the study. And I don't want to bury you in detail here, but I think it's important just to share with you, our discussions and our analysis here. The statistical power of any clinical trial, the ability of a clinical trial to pick up differences between treatments, is based partly on the number of patients in the study, but also in the period of time for which those patients have been followed. If you recruit 150 patients yesterday and you look at them today, very unlikely you're going to see a result. If you recruit 150 patients 3 years ago and you look at them today, well, if your drug's doing anything at all, the chances are you'll see it. Now, we know that GBM Agile has recruited about 4 times faster than was ever originally envisaged. And because of the COVID pandemic last year, that recruitment has probably been quite backloaded. We actually think the majority of our patients probably came in the first half of this year. So as a result, we've had a much shorter average period of observation in this study than I think was originally envisaged. And we hypothesized that the graduation analysis may therefore have occurred with much, much less statistical power than the study was designed for. Now, we can only really speculate on this. We don't have the data to confirm these things, but I think we've got a pretty reasonable guess that this is part of what's going on here. But then even putting that to one side, as you can see in the third panel on the slide, in any clinical trial, if you look too early, the curves are usually very close together. And over time, as you follow them, they separate. Now, the final analysis for GBM Agile will occur next year, and it will be fully 12 months after the final patient recruited. And an awful lot can happen to a clinical trial in 12 months. So we think this study is still got a great deal of potential to support the registration of Paxlovid. We think that this has been overinterpreted, this non-graduation decision. And we think that we're going to have to wait and see what the data looks like next year. Next slide, please. So what happens when we do get that data next year? Well, look, we'll have to read it and see, but there's a number of ways this could still support us. So one possibility is that the first stage of the study, remember 150 patients on Paxlovid, roughly the same number of patients again in the control group, so effectively a randomized controlled trial of about 300 patients. That could still support a full FDA approval next year. Another possibility is that FDA grants us what they call accelerated approval. So they say, look, this is pretty good and patients need new therapies. You can get out there and sell your drug, but we want you to do another clinical study in parallel. And we're very happy to do that. This is a common occurrence for cancer drugs, but we'll be selling the drug in the background. And so this would be absolutely no problem at all. There's a variant of this where they say, look, you're almost there, but we want you to do another study of, say, 50 patients just to really confirm this and lock it down. And again, I think we'd be quite happy to do that if we have to. Another possibility is they say, look, you're not quite hitting the target in the overall population, but in patients under 65 or patients with good renal function or patients who've had a total resection of their tumor, actually the drug's working really well, so we'll approve you in that group. And again, this happens all the time for cancer drugs, and that's fine because we can get out and sell it. So there's a lot of ways this could move forward, and we'll only know next year when we start seeing data, but this is not a busted flush. Next slide, please. Now, this has sort of been one event that I think has really had a lot of impact this year. But I think there's been a background anxiety as well for the company, and that's around financial position. And again, this is a complex slide, but we wanted to really share all the data with you. This is drawn entirely from our public filings on ASX, our Appendix 4C filings. And as you can see, the dark red bars here represents our expenditure R&D. The light pink sections are G&A expenditure, light blue licensing, and dark blue financing. And then the gray is sort of other things like Forex. A couple of points jump out here. First of all, just reiterate a point we've made in previous AGMs. Kazia is one of the most efficient biotech companies on ASX. We spend about 80 cents of every dollar on R&D, and that continues to be the case. And our cash burn, as you can see here, is roughly a little under 6 million Australian dollars a quarter. I hate that term cash burn, to be honest, because we don't burn a single cent in this company. We invest it in clinical trials and in research, and the payoff for that investment is the data that we present and that we've seen throughout the year. But nevertheless, we spend a little under $6 million a quarter, and that's been fairly constant for the last little while. Now, we have actually fully funded that expenditure over the last couple of quarters, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment too. But the company has been running, as a result, at a pretty flat cash balance. You see around $7 million in the first quarter, around $7 million in the second quarter, a little bit lower, down around $5.5 million, I think, in the third quarter. We actually then brought another $1.4 million US in October, so a bit of a timing mismatch there, but would be back to about $7 million after that. So we run at a kind of constant cash balance throughout the whole year of about $7 million, and we spend about a little under $6 million a quarter. Now, the trouble with that is that people look at us and they say, well, you've got about $7 million at the bank and you spend a little under $6 million a quarter. So you've got about a quarter of cash at the bank, and things are looking hairy. We've actually had about a quarter of cash at the bank all year, and we're still going strong. But this, the analysis, the simple analysis of cash divided by burn rate, really makes us look a little more fraught than I think we really are. And I think this has weighed on investor sentiment over the course of this year. Now, why have we been doing it this way, you might ask? Well, if we move to the next slide, I think one of the background realities here is that this has been an enormously challenging year for capital markets. We touched on this a few slides ago, but I just wanted to share some data here about capital markets transactions during 2022. As you can see from the left-hand panel, there has been vastly fewer transactions and very, very much less money raised in 2022 than in either 2021 or in 2020. The market for new equity raises has absolutely dried up. When you're in the US and you talk to the bankers, they used to be doing 3 or 4 transactions a week. They're now doing perhaps 2 or 3 a month, and they've already started, quite substantial downsizing on Wall Street. These transactions have been taking place at very punishing terms, as you can see in the middle panel here, for companies our size, under about $100 million, typically 20% plus discounts. And this is actually makes it look better than it really is, because most of the deals that are taking place are being led by insiders. And the few deals that are bringing in predominantly new investors, that figure's closer to 30 to 40%. And I should add that the typical transaction comes with at least 100% warrant coverage. That is to say, for every share that's issued, there's at least one accompanying call option. And as a result of these very onerous terms, the aftermarket performance you can see on the right-hand panel has not been great. And we've been very reluctant to subject our shareholders to the very dilutive kind of deals that this represents. So what have we been doing instead? Well, next slide, please. We put in place earlier this year an at-the-market financing facility on NASDAQ, which is led by Oppenheimer and Company. Now, for those who aren't familiar, an ATM facility is a very common instrument. About half of NASDAQ biotech companies have them. Allows us to place shares directly into the market and raise money very economically. We sell, and we can only sell at the bid price at that moment, so there is no discount, there is no warrant coverage, and we pay about 3% fees to bankers compared to about 6 to 8% in a more conventional financing transaction. Now, there's been a lot of debate, I think, among some of our shareholders about what this does to the share price, what this means. And I would say, again, this is a pretty ubiquitous instrument. It's a bit more high profile for us because we have higher disclosure requirements under ASX than a typical NASDAQ company would do. But we're a science company, so we answer these questions with data, and this is the data. We've used the instrument 18 times over the past 6 months, so somewhere between once a week and once a fortnight, we dip into the market on average. And in general, on average, we've taken in any given month a little under 5% of the trade on NASDAQ. We obviously don't take any of the trade on ASX because the facility doesn't operate here. So less than 1 in 20 shares sold in Kazia are sold by us. The other 19 out of 20 shares are sold by other parties, by existing holders. Nothing to do with us, nothing to do with our ATM. What happens to the share price when we use it? Well, very, very difficult to make a like-for-like comparison. But in general, on the 18 days that we've used it, our share price has gone down a little bit on a volume-weighted average, but it's gone down less than it has on the days where we haven't used it. So there really isn't a clear signal here that the ATM has any kind of suppressive effect on the share price. And we've done other analysis here. We've done linear regressions and all sorts of things to really see if we can find any relationship between our participation in the market and the share price. And take it from me, there is none. But this instrument has raised 7.2 million US dollars for us, about 10 million Aussie dollars. And that money has been raised at an average of a 9.4% premium to the day's share price. So we are one of the only companies out there in our market cap band that is raising money at any kind of premium. And again, no options, no warrants, very low fees. And the average price here, I can't quite read the slide, but I think the average price is around $2.40 US on NASDAQ. It's the equivalent of about 36 cents a share in Australia, very roughly speaking. So we've succeeded in raising this money at a good price. Now, I don't want to spend too long trying to sort of justify this. I recognize that, as shareholders, nobody likes to see the company issuing any shares, and the board of the company, feels the same way. We'd rather not issue shares at all. But in a market where we have to continue to finance the company, this has been the best way to do it. Now, it's clearly not something we can continue to rely on. This is not a long-term solution. It's never really intended to be a primary source of financing for the company when we put it in place. I'm very glad we've had it as a safety net this year, but we are going to be looking at other things as we move forward. So next slide, please. And this is my last slide. I think it's just a nice segue into talking about what we do over the course of next year. And we've been spending a lot of time over the past couple of months in the boardroom and among the management team talking about how we move Kazia forward for success and how we recoup some of the withdrawal that we've had during the course of this year. And so I've listed here some of the things that we've completed from this, and you'll hear more from us over the course of the year ahead on this, because we'll be tracking ourselves to these objectives and encourage you as shareholders to do the same. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to reduce costs in the company. We spend our money on R&D, but I think we need to recognize that money is an expensive commodity at the moment. We need to ease off here. And so you will see from us a 50% cost reduction in 2023 versus 2022. That's actually beginning already in the fourth quarter, but it'll really start to hit as we head into the new year. And then now I have to peer around here to see the slides here. So we also will be investigating other sources of capital for the company. I think the ATM, as I said, has been a great safety net for us, but we don't want this to continue to be the primary source of financing for the company. So work underway to look at other ways to finance ourselves. We'll be looking, of course, at non-dilutive opportunities. So a couple of irons in the fire there. The warning I always give to shareholders is that particularly grant opportunities are slow, and you have to put in a lot of submissions to be successful. But we do have the backing of some great researchers and clinicians. We've got some very strong projects ongoing, so we think we've got a lot to play for here. We continue to diversify what we're doing beyond glioblastoma. I think one of the things we've always wanted to is make sure we're not a one-trick pony, a single bet on glioblastoma. And I think I'm very glad that we have the work that's ongoing, childhood brain cancer, brain mets, and you'll see a lot more focus from us on those things as we move into 2023. And I think one of the things we're also very sensitive to is that because of the way we do our clinical trials, because we're more than usually reliant on the clinicians we work with, we're a little bit at their mercy in terms of data readouts. And that unfortunately goes with the territory, but we'll be working really hard to try and lock these guys down to very, very clear timetables for data in 2023. My colleague, Dr. John Friend, our Chief Medical Officer, is actually in Florida right now, meeting with most of our investigators at the Society for Neuro-Oncology annual meeting. And one of the things he's really going to be doing is saying, when are you going to have data for us? Let's make sure we make this very crystalline. And then last few things here is, as you can see, one of the key things I really want to single out, the last thing at the bottom, is we need to get out there and talk more to investors and to our shareholders. I think the timely thing is that with all the restrictions associated with the pandemic lifting, it's a lot easier for us to get out and speak to people. And we clearly need to get out there and remind people what we're doing, remind people of the enormous potential and promise inherent in both of our molecules, and thereby, I think, to start rebuilding the value of the company. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to stop there, and I'd be very happy at this point to take your questions. So, thank you. So the question was around Paxaloside in China. Obviously, we had hoped to include China in the GBM Agile study. Now that it's effectively fully recruited, that won't be happening. We're in discussion with our partner Simcere there. As most people in the room will be aware, we partnered last year with Simcere Pharmaceutical to commercialize in China. And to some extent, this is going to be their call. Probably wait until next year when we sort of see data, and then ultimately the Chinese regulatory environment will require a standalone registration study in China. So we're already talking a little bit about what that will look like. So, so this may slow us down by 6 months or so in China, but it's not unusual for drugs to end up having to do a standalone study in China. Yeah, Steve, thank you. And so the question again, just for those online, was whether there's any opportunity to re-enter GBM Agile. Look, I think the first thing says we probably won't need to. You know, I think we're still expecting that when we see data next year, at the very least, it should give us a clear answer for Paxaloside as a monotherapy. So it's going to fundamentally either tell us the drug works or it doesn't. That's our expectation. GBM Agile is purely a glioblastoma study, so we wouldn't look to that study to explore the drug and say brain metastases or in childhood brain cancer. That's just not what it's designed to do. It's purely glioblastoma. The one scenario where we could conceivably consider re-entering it would be if we had, say, combination data in glioblastoma. And we do have a study ongoing with ketogenesis and hypoinsulinemia, which we haven't really spoken about today because we'll have more to say about it next year. If that data came out next year and looked stellar, we could look to become a new arm in GBM Agile there. Look, if you'd asked me that question, Steve, in August, I would have said, sure, when hell freezes over, you know, we'll go back to one of these studies. I think that would be unduly harsh. I think we have to be open-minded here. You know, I think let's wait and see the final results before we decide whether we do another one of these academic-led studies or whether we try and do this more ourselves. Yeah, Mark, no, it's a great question. So again, the question was, why has this been such a bad year for PI3K companies and brain cancer companies? Brain cancer, it's fair to say, is an unloved disease area. And the simple reality is it's been failure prone. A lot of people have tried. There's been a lot of cancer vaccine approaches. There's been immunotherapy approaches, even people trying to do things like CAR T and brain cancer. And it's so far, it's all tanked. And so investors are wary. And in a market where people are very risk off, as the analyst says, a market where people are very, very resistant to these, you know, sort of more complex stories, disease areas like brain cancer are often the first to suffer. So I think that's what's going on there. In the PI3K class, there's something a bit more specific that's been happening. There have been 5 drugs approved by FDA in the PI3K class. Now, 4 of those are approved for blood cancers, and they were approved on relatively thin data at the time. And FDA, over the course of this year in particular, has been coming out and saying, well, actually, we have concerns now about the long-term safety of some of these drugs, and we think maybe the data that was used to prove them was a bit too thin. So 2 things have happened. FDA has said for any future PI3K inhibitor approvals in blood cancer, they want to see randomized controlled trials with survival endpoints. And the second thing is that because of this new requirement, at least 2 of the drugs in the class, well, one of them has been withdrawn from the market, TG Therapeutics umbralisib, and I think one of them's in the firing line. I think it's still hanging on by its fingernails, but duvelisib, Copictral from Secura Bio. So I think this has put a cloud over the PI3K inhibitor class. Now, what does this mean for us? Well, look, short answer is it means nothing for us. We already have a randomized controlled trial with a survival endpoint in GBM Agile. So we are already providing the kind of data that FDA has said they want to see, and then some. Second, we're in a disease that's very, very different from lymphoma and CLL, and the diseases that these drugs have been targeting. The kinds of diseases we're treating do not have other treatment options. Lymphoma is actually quite busy at the moment. There's a lot of new therapies that have been coming on, a lot of new treatments. You know, FDA can set the bar quite high, but for brain cancer, it's the exact opposite. There is nothing. It's a desert. And so I think the agency is likely to be a little bit more open-minded to drugs in this disease area. And then finally, in the 350 patients or so of clinical experience in paxilosib, we have not been seeing any of these safety concerns with our drug. We haven't been seeing any evidence of liver toxicity, any GI perforations. We haven't been seeing, you know, really any significant amount of febrile neutropenia, and any of these things that have been scary with some of these older drugs in the class. We think we actually have potentially a best-in-class safety profile here with paxilosib, but this has certainly been a much less scary development program than some of these older drugs. So we don't think it matters for us, but sentiment is against PI3K at the moment. I don't think it makes a difference, to be honest. I think we're in such a different disease area that I don't think there's going to be any sort of crosstalk, if you like. And I think if we were targeting blood cancers, then I'd be a little more nervous. And you know, there are some companies that are doing it. So one of the companies on the slide there, MEI Pharma, you know, has had a PI3K inhibitor, are developing for blood cancers, and that's why their share price is down, I think, 89%. But we've taken a very, very different direction with our drug. We've deliberately stayed away from those kind of indications. Thank you. And look, I'll try and just summarize that very briefly for those online. So the question was really around just some of the response of the stock to news in the US, in particular, this phenomenon where you sometimes get a really good start on the day and then it tails off. And the question was around, is there shorting going on, and so on. Look, so first thing to say is this isn't actually completely unusual. I saw some analyst research out of Morgan Stanley in roughly the middle of the year, and they went through all the news releases from NASDAQ-listed biotech companies. And they looked at what happens when a company releases news, and they found that if the news was negative, on average, the company's share price declined by 50% on the day, which is horrendous, but no great surprise. And of course, that's what happened to us on the 1st of August when we came out with this GBM Agile news. So it rings true. But interestingly, they found that when a company releases positive news, their share price declines by 10% on the day. So, you know, it's a bit of a catch-22. The conclusion maybe the best thing is just to keep quiet. So we're probably not the only company that sees a little bit of this. Now, we've asked the question as well, what on earth is going on? Now, we don't think that short selling is any very significant contributor to this. It's just not an awful lot of stock to borrow, frankly. You know, most of our stock is in retail hands. It doesn't get lent out for shorting. And frankly, we're a lousy candidate for shorting, because when you short a stock, you want to be pretty confident it's going to go down, and you want liquidity. You know, where you know, you want a stock that's overvalued and liquid. We're undervalued and relatively illiquid. So we're and biotech in particular is one of these industries where one good readout can double or treble the share price in a day, and that can be very unfortunate if you've got a big short position. So the only data source we can look to is NASDAQ itself. They do provide data on stocks available for shorting. When we look at Kazia there, we show up with an absolutely tiny short interest. It's next to nothing. Now, whether that's the whole story or not, I can't tell you, but on all available information, we really can't identify it. We have spoken to a number of analysts and advisors and bankers and said, what is this strange profile? I'm glad to hear, by the way, I'm not the only person that stays up to 1 or 2 in the morning watching the share price. Makes me feel a little bit less lonely when I'm watching the NASDAQ open. But one suggestion that's been put to us, and I'm not nearly enough of a financier to really know if this rings true, but the suggestion is the stock has attracted the interest of day traders. They see press releases go out, they buy the stock without even necessarily reading it. They just wait to see if it doubles in price, and if it doesn't, they sell out and move on. We get this churn, and that certainly again rings true because we see a lot of the volume in the morning. We see this burst of activity, and it tails off in the afternoon. Whatever the explanation is, there doesn't seem to be an awful lot we can honestly do about it, except just to get out there and tell the story. I think the reality is the share market is often imbalanced in the short term. I do kind of believe it generally gets it right in the medium to long term. I think we just have to focus on the long game and maybe not be too distracted by these kind of day-to-day ups and downs, because I think that is the thing that whatever is going on will clear it out, is really being able to demonstrate that long-term trajectory. I'm conscious of time, but I just want to address another point that Steve touched on, and we may have time for just one or two questions from online. But the other question that was sort of wrapped up there is around NASDAQ, around our bid price, which, as you say, is under $1. And for those that are familiar with NASDAQ, be aware that there is a requirement on NASDAQ to maintain a minimum bid price of $1. We are currently trading under that threshold. And if we trade under that threshold for 30 consecutive trading days, we will receive a NASDAQ deficiency notice. And we do expect to receive that at some point in the next few weeks. Now, the consequences of this are limited in the short term. We have a 6-month cure period to get our share price above $1. And we can then ask for an extension to get this, which essentially gets us another 6 months. So, practical purposes, we likely have 12 months to get ourselves back above $1 before there is any possibility of delisting from NASDAQ. And sad to say, with the market being where it is, we are not the only company in this position. In fact, several of the companies on one of my slides there have also recently received NASDAQ deficiency notices. There's a lot of this about. It's unwelcome, I won't deny. It's be frustrating and annoying, but it has no real near-term implications for business. As I say, we've got 12 months to fix it, and I'm extremely optimistic the share price will be back over $1 in that period. I want to make sure we don't shortchange those online. So if we have another minute or two, perhaps we can just address a couple of the questions that have been coming through from online, just to make sure we do justice to everybody.
James, you've covered.
Thanks, Kate. And again, the question for anybody online who didn't hear, is the company thinking about suspending any of the activity around EVT-801, our second drug to conserve cash? Look, ideally not. I think we haven't really spoken much about it today just because of where this drug is and its development, but we're actually also really excited about EVT-801. We think it genuinely has huge potential. We wouldn't have brought it in if we didn't feel that way. So I think it'd be very reluctant to shortchange EVT-801 at this stage. What we might look at doing is just altering the sequencing of events a little bit over the course of next year. We might move a few things around, we might bring some things forward, push other things back, and just change the sequence of things a little bit, partly to phase our cash expenditure a little bit better over the course of next year. And I think that could give us some savings in 2023, and partly also to try and drive that to data that we can then take out to investors as early as possible. I think we want to be able to talk to investors about the potential we see in that drug, and so the earlier we've got good credible data, the better. So we are looking at some ways to tinker with it. We may adjust it a little bit, but I think it would be a terrible shame if we stopped working on it, and that's not our plan at this stage. Yeah, Mark, it's a good question. So again, for those online, the question was around the company's own phase 2 study of paxilosib in glioblastoma, and whether whether if we had a more equivocal result out of GBM Agile, whether we can sort of pool the two together. Now, to some extent, that always happens. So FDA will always examine the totality of the evidence for a drug, not just the pivotal clinical study, but all the other work that's going on, the aggregate safety data, even the preclinical data. So they do take a very, very broad-ranging look at things. Our phase 2 study was not designed to support registration. And it's a relatively smaller study, about 30 patients. So there's probably a limited sense to which it would directly outweigh a negative result in GBM Agile if that ended up being the result next year. However, it certainly would help us to interpret that data. I think we would look at it closely, and if we did get a different result between the two studies, I think we'd look very closely to understand why. And just as a reminder, that study reported overall survival of 15.7 months. The comparison point there for the existing standard of care, 12.7 months. The data was presented this year at ASCO, at ESMO, the European Society of Medical Oncology, and it is being presented this week at the Society for Neuro-Oncology meeting in Tampa, Florida. So it gives you a sense that this data has been subject of high interest. So it all feeds in. It's all grist to the mill. Very difficult at this stage to know quite what role it's going to play in the overall picture. But look, it's going to be an input, but perhaps not a casting vote.
Okay, James. I think we are now at the stage where you've done enough. There's going to be more questions as we go through the formal business, I'm sure. But thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.